Hi, Roy here. I thought I'd pop in for another Private Eye July update. Second week of reading has happened, and this time leaving behind the sun-drenched mean streets of California, it's been British stuff. The first reading I did was Sexton Blake. Sexton Blake is probably the longest running detective series of all. Nick Carter gives him a run for his money in sheer number of stories, but unlike Blake, he is reinvented not really as a detective. So the latter day Nick Carter Killmaster, they're spy stories, even though his origins were as a detective character back at the end of the 19th century. So in the wake of the success of Sherlock Holmes and his disappearance, because Conan Doyle got fed up writing about him, lots of new characters were developed in that sort of detective mould, and Sexton Blake was one of them. You could see him initially as being something of a copy of Sherlock Holmes, with his Baker Street address, where he's looked after by a housekeeper, with his habit of wearing a dressing gown and doing experiments and smoking pipes and stuff like that. But there are differences too, both in style and content. So unlike Sherlock Holmes, Sexton Blake's assistant is actually a young man or boy called Tinker, who he's kind of rescued from the streets and takes on as his mentee. And he also has a bloodhound called Pedro. So no Watson, although Blake himself, amongst his many accomplishments, is a qualified doctor. So maybe there's just no need for it. And it's really the style, I suppose, because Blake is much more of an adventure character. In fact, you could say it's a weakness of the stories that they tend to lead on action and adventure, and there's not always a great deal of deduction. But, you know, he's put across as being like the greatest detective in the world, called upon by Scotland Yard when they need to help solving cases, that kind of thing. And of course the sheer number of stories running into the thousands, which for some people make it kind of unfeasible that he could be like a real character. Even the most profligate pastiche writers who like to team up detectives with other detectives, you know, so they might have Holmes and Poirot and others sort of gathered around solving a case. Even they would say, oh, Sexton Blake's not here because he's a fictional character. Probably a sort of cunning ruse to keep people off his track. So started life very much in the Holmesian mode. There was a weird period where a lot of the stories had him disguised and adopting some sort of job, such as a railwayman, bookmaker, school teacher, etc. But there was really an exciting period in the early 20th century where his enemies tended to be sort of master crooks, very colourful characters like Zenith the Albino. So initially he was in publications like this. He started life in the Halfpenny Marvel, but the Union Jack weekly story paper with these very densely typeset pages of lightly illustrated stories were really where he lived and breathed and had his being initially, though he was in lots of other places as well. So that's a lot of words to get out, and that meant he was doing lots of things. One week he might be in Africa, another week, you know, in America, doing all sorts of things as the writers came up with new ideas to keep these stories fresh and give him new exciting things to do. Another thing they used to do was to put him in some like large city in England and then advertise that locally, so everyone in Sheffield would get that week's Union Jack, because Sexton Blake had gone to Sheffield to solve a mystery. And I've done lots of videos about him. So started off in this kind of paper and continued. So whereas lots of other characters would sort of fade away, Blake never quite disappeared. Went through 2 wars. You can see him knocking a Nazi off of a U-boat at some point in the Second World War. But by the 1950s, the stories got quite sort of quiet. So now you had this format of magazine, and I believe these were fortnightly. So you got 64 pages of print plus covers, and still quite long stories, but unlike the days when his enemies could be like Waldo the Wonder Man or Miss Death, now you get things like gambling syndicates and fraud and doping horse races and malfeasance in the local council, that kind of thing. So it's a kind of a quiet period, although I actually quite like these stories. But I guess he was due for some sort of a refresh, which came in the 1960s, which people called the New Order, where, faced with competition from the hard-boiled detective stories from America and the sort of the changing social attitudes, I suppose, and James Bond and all of his imitators, then we had a new style Blake. So the covers are pulpy, covers that could stand up against the American magazines. He still lives at Baker Street, but he now has his detective offices in Berkeley Square with staff, assistants. So it becomes quite realistic that there's a sort of a big enterprise with lots of mundane cases being solved by all sorts of people. But Blake, with Tinker, though he's now known more by his actual name, Edward Carter, and he's more like a sort of early 20s kind of chap. He's got this sort of more professional kind of existence, and you get stories that go into sort of Bondian territory, overseas locations, that kind of stuff. Although Blake himself and his immediate supporting cast are pretty much still the sort of straight arrows that they always have been. So thinking about this vast volume of stories, I guess that's why on one level they're looked down upon. He's called the office boy's Sherlock Holmes.
Biting.
I know. On the other hand, you get people like Dorothy L. Sayers saying it's a national folklore, and having one of her characters pick up a Blake to read on the train. So I think she might.
Lord Peter?
No, it's the policeman in the Whimsy stories.
Yeah, can't remember his name. Oh, no, marries his sister.
Blimey.
Well,
Got something out of Peyton Place. Oh, you mean Whimsy's sister?
Whimsy's sister.
Right.
Sister.
Okay.
I think he marries Lady Mary.
Anyway.
Anyway, moving on.
Yes, so, where am I in the depths of the New Order? Vast array of writers still, and the writers are often more colourful than the characters in the stories. A raffish crew. I won't go into all that, but it makes interesting reading if you delve into Blakeana a little bit. Here's a Christmas illustration from a Sexton Blake, where you see a mixture of characters and writers and people involved in the publishers. They switched up the format to paperbacks fairly thin paperbacks, but still something a little bit more book-like for this series. And then they kind of petered out. There was a TV show in the late 70s, I think I'm the only person on earth that thinks it's any good, that was adapted into a book. And now we've got more recent stuff. Michael Moorcock, well-known science fiction and fantasy author, he worked on the Blakes early in his career as a young man, doing all sorts of things, writing text pieces for annuals and stuff like that. And wrote one of these called Caribbean Crisis, that has a awkward publication history that I won't go into, easy to find online, and also in the introduction of this, which is that very story, but it's been rewritten and expanded, because among other things, when it originally appeared, it had a lot of rewrites, partly for sort of political differences between himself and the editor. So we've never sort of had the real version, and it could do with a bit more breathing space, and obviously it's fun to update it as well. Should point out, here's this character created in the late 19th century, still around, still doing stuff. And although it's never explained in any kind of mystical or science fictional way why he, and in fact some of the people around him, do not age, that is the case. So it's still the same guy. It's not like, let's relaunch it all, or it's not his grandson, it's not another dimension, or it's not a sort of bit like James Bond movies where you just sort of think, well, somehow it's happening in the present. Nobody sort of worries too much about, how could he possibly have been in the Second World War, and now this. Blake is eternal. It's no big deal, he just is. So, there's actually 2 books in one in this, Caribbean Crisis and a prequel, Voodoo Island. So here we've got Michael Moorcock collaborating with Mark Hodder, who, as well as being an author in his own right, is also a massive Blake fan and expert. So 2 for the price of 1. And it's a lot of fun. I mean, this book also has an awkward publication history. Not my story to tell. I will say I'm not too impressed with the cover, but there is a bathysphere in the story. We start off with a locked room mystery under the sea, where 2 men descend in a bathysphere in the Caribbean, and there's desperate cries coming over the radio, and it seems like they can only see one dead body in the vehicle who's been stabbed. So where's the other person gone? How can they have escaped from a bathysphere at far too low in the water to actually come out of it?
Mystery.
Yeah, it is. Wow. Yeah. So that's good. Back in London, there's Blake, now still being a private detective. That's his job. And he's approached by a sort of industrialist who's well in with the British government, who wants him to help find his son in that well-known Caribbean country, Mariba, who's disappeared. And at the same time as all this bathysphere business has been going on. So Blake is sort of being sent on a government mission, if you like, which is a little bit more spy-like, and yet he's using private detective skills, so it's still, we may be pushing the edges of the genre a little bit, but it's still a detective story. He decides he will do it. He goes solo, so he's not taking Tinker with him or any of these new associates like his I think Paula Dane is one of his assistants in the office. He sends her to Sheffield. Well, she's solving cases, so that sort of thing. So this is around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it isn't Cuba, but it's very Cuba-like. So that's part of the background. And then what do you get? You get a classic Blake story, lots of action, lots of twists. This was how they worked. Each chapter would have its cliffhanger. It drives along. Blake has to fight his way out of a few situations. There's a climactic battle on a boat. It's great. And he solves the bathysphere mystery as well. Evocative surroundings and a baddie from Blake's past. So there's a little bit of stuff. Now, I haven't got the original Caribbean Crisis Sexton Blake Library edition. They're quite expensive to find now, so I can't compare them. But the way one of the baddies is has aged, whereas Blake hasn't. I'm not sure they would have mentioned that in the original. That's quite fun, and there's a nice kind of laugh on the bridge type of thing at the end back in Baker Street with talking to Tinker about the 60s and how things are changing and beatniks and that sort of stuff. Good times. Really looking forward to reading the second half. Great work by Mark Hodder, Michael Moorcock, and whose continuing love for the character is a great thing. And I believe, although we're not getting another Sexton Blake exactly, Seaton Begg, Metatemporal Detective, another one of Moorcock's creations, is going to be reappearing soon. So we'll be looking out for that. So that was my Sexton Blake reading. I'll just mention these passed into Cockney rhyming slang. A Sexton Blake is a fake. So you could even just call something a sexton. That's what it would mean. Now, I can't think of any other detectives who've been sort of immortalised in that way. From there, from a very well-known character to a pretty minor character, from Schoolgirls Weekly. So I mentioned Sylvia Silence earlier, not in this video, in the previous video. So a writer called John William Bobin, or is it Bobbin? I think it's Bobin, there's only one B. He created Sylvia Silence for this story paper, which, whereas Union Jack is for boys, this was marketed to girls. And she was a great girl detective character. Probably be saying more about her in due course. Bobin went on to create a shorter-lived young female detective called Lila Lyle in Schoolgirls Own, which is a companion paper. Not seen any of her stories yet. And then, towards the end of his life, in 1933, created Valerie Drew. Yes, Drew. So by then, Nancy Drew books had appeared in the US, and there's an element of copying going on. Like, the first Nancy Drew book is The Secret of the Old Clock. Just fact check that. Yes, The Secret of the Old Clock. Now you get Valerie Drew in That Amazing Room of Clocks. So the apple hasn't fallen too far from the tree, but Valerie Drew is a great character and is much more an evolution of the Sylvia Silence, Lila Lyle characters than a copy of Nancy. For a start, she is effectively a private investigator. I'm not quite sure she would survive the most thorough vetting, but she takes cases, she gets paid for them, and her dad has been a police commissioner, so she sort of learned the trade by helping him. So she's nationally famous as that girl who solves crimes. A bit older than Sylvia Silence. So Sylvia Silence starts off as a 15-year-old who sort of assists and follows in the footsteps of her father, who's a detective who plays violins and stuff like that. Sexton Blake, probably. Valerie Drew ends up having her own apartment. She can fly planes. And she's in this kind of fervent world of the girls' story magazines as well. I mean, there's loads of great characters in these. Sylvia Silence had page mates like Eldorado Nell in A Western Story and Vi the Ventriloquist, as well as more like school stories like the duffer of the school, that kind of stuff. So here I got A Schoolgirls Weekly. This is quite late on, so by then Bobin has died. Other hands are writing the Valerie Drew stories, which were quite popular. People particularly liked her Alsatian assistant Flash. So whereas Sylvia Silence had a Alsatian and a monkey, now we just get a dog, but he sometimes gets his own stories because he's got almost human levels of deductive ability. And then you get this great other stories like the Carol of the Crimson Mask. So by day she is poor. But by night she puts this mask on and is moves in the highest circles of society as a virtuoso violinist. Anyway, yes, so this Nancy Drew, this Valerie Drew story, The Fortune Teller's Warning, is pretty cool. She has a job to do debunking a fortune teller, which she does, but the predictions the fortune teller has given her all begin coming true, and they include various kinds of danger, like falling in water. So again, like Sylvia Silence, she goes down into things, she climbs up things. There's this kind of action-packed sort of, very self-reliant kind of activity. There's a car plunging into a bridge. So great stuff. Yes, Carol of the Crimson Mask. Sorry, I didn't really explain her very well. Meet the masked girl of mystery, the girl with two identities, the girl who is poor in the daytime, rich at night time. Yeah. And you also got, I'll tell you what this book is in a sec, Tessa the Trapezist of Tarantino's... can't speak. Tessa the Trapezist of Taranto's Circus. Filmstruck Faye. Greta, the girl all animals loved. Susie, the pride of the factory. And you do often get this, either working class characters or the less working class characters like these girl detectives helping out the, servants who've been unjustly accused and stuff like that. So I guess they kind of knew their readership. This book I picked up, The Lady Investigates, by Patricia Craig and Mary Cadogan. Women detectives and spies in fiction. It's good. It's like not a super academic sort of chin stroker. It's a really entertaining survey of of what it says of women in detective and spy stories. So through a period, seems like you get up to Modesty Blaze era. So that was cool. There's a whole chapter about Sylvia Silence. From Sylvia Silence to the Silent Three, sleuths and secret societies in the schoolgirl papers. And there's Sylvia Silence jumping out of a windmill, grabbing onto the windmill sail. Famous scene, famous on this channel and on Pat's, because Book Chat with Pat has been reading them too. Right, got completely lost there, but Valerie Drew, detective, obviously riffing on Nancy Drew, but she had this life in the world of British girls' papers. Oh yeah, so Jess Nevins, in his pulp encyclopedia, talks about how she encounters a teenaged female jungle hero, a yellow peril, air pirates, supposedly haunted houses, a doppelganger, a whispering painting, a crime conspiracy called the League of the Golden Mask, the Hunchback of Tahiti, and a modern-day Robin Hood. So what's not to like there? He also ventures the opinion that Valerie Drew's stories are better than Nancy Drew's stories because they come out of this crazy British pulp tradition like Sexton Blake, where you have this immense variety of story type. I've not read enough of either to confirm or deny that opinion. I just throw it in there. Okay, so 2 things I've read. Pretty much at the outer limits of private investigatordom. Next week I'll be back on more solid territory. I'll show you some of the... Got some acquisitions as well, so these are probably things I won't get to read this Private Eye July, but Stuart M. Kaminsky wrote a follow-up novel about Jim Rockford. I picked up a couple more Shel Scott books with the brilliant covers and the wacky titles. Dig That Crazy Grave.
Is it really?
Yeah. Report for a Corpse by Peter Chambers, or is it by Henry Kane? I think one of them is the character, one of them is the author. Yeah, Henry Kane is the author. I got this because it's a Dell map back.
Woohoo!
So this is
I had one of them for a while.
These are great. So bunch of paperbacks, many genres, always with a map on the back, and the map could be the diagram of a room, or the layout of a building, or of a city, or of a country, whatever you can do geographically to help interpret the... So, yeah, that looks good. It looks a little bit like Shel Scott, I suppose. Report for a Corpse. Opening line, it was crazier than 7 Picassos upside down. So,
that's rubbish. That's terrible.
In the greenest light of early morning, and you're drunk on rum and remembrance and fresh from your only beloved, except that $5,000 banked along the edge of the desk in small heaped hundreds give it the unreal aspect of normalcy. Could be a bit overwritten, but looking forward to finding out. I've got a Ken Bruin novel from his Galway series from the library. So yeah, I probably will read this. I mean, it's book length, but it's probably, looking at the spacing of the lines, is probably not much more than a novella really, so I should get that to read that in the next couple of weeks. And in the dying days of Private Eye July, I'm going to switch from real books to comics, including Howard the Duck, who has become the private investigator of the Marvel Universe. So yeah, there you go. Off now to stalk grouse on the moors with Richard Hannay. So
You look more like a beater than a shooter.
thank you for the support.
You're welcome.
Back soon with something else.